It's hard work to get rid of junk. It's hard work to do oversight. It's hard work to hold the agencies accountable. And so what they'd rather do is look good at home, get reelected, and continue to spend money. And that's Republican and Democrat alike.
The State Department was all set to spend a little over $5,000 of your taxpayer dollars last year on a project they deemed critically necessary: a blow-up, human-size foosball field for an embassy in Belize. I say was because they canceled it for fear it would go public and Senator Tom Coburn would mark it in his yearly waste book findings. It's a fine example of where your money is going every single day, and a good place to focus on why tax increases are considered ridiculous when billions are tossed into the figurative waste receptacle. Our guest is the former Chief Administrative Officer of the U.S. House of Representatives in the 104th Congress, also the author of Naked Emperors: The Failure of the Republican Revolution. Let's welcome Scot Faulkner to MidPoint today. Scott, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to it.
Just checking, Scott, you don't have an inflatable foosball field, just before we get going, do you?
No, or anything else inflatable.
That's what I was thinking. You never know. The State Department may say that it absolutely is necessary, but I think that really points out what we're talking about here. Before we get onto the taxes issue, let's deal with the waste here. This is nothing new. I remember hearing about this when I was a kid, that the government wastes money. It used to be on the space program, used to be in military as well. We're still here. It seems as if no one wants to address it. People are afraid of it. They walk away from this like it's radioactive. Why?
I really don't know. I mean, you're right. When we were growing up, you had William Proxmire from Wisconsin had his Golden Fleece Award that he gave out every month. And as you mentioned, Senator Coburn, who just retired, he's had his waste book, and he also issued interim reports. It is stunning that Congress, it's one of its fundamental duties and responsibilities is to conduct oversight over the executive branch, and they don't.
We keep hearing about pet projects, and I guess that's probably the one place that we need to start. Every time a bill comes along, there's got to be 6 or 7 pieces, or maybe 6 or 7,000 pieces of pork that are stuffed in there. What is it that the normal, average voter can do? They send these people to represent them. They tell them to spend our money wisely, yet we hear about it. It's not as if it all of a sudden is unknown. It's hidden. We find out. So what can we do? How do we put pressure on these guys here, Scott?
I think the key is to do citizen oversight. If you find waste, even coming across it on an internet news feed. I mean, the Government Exec magazine publishes Inspector General report highlights every few weeks, and so it's out there in the public domain. And to write members of Congress and say, look, especially nowadays they do emails. Send them the link and say, look at this.
But they don't seem to be listening, Scott. I think that's the big thing. Whether it comes down to letters or email, we can email ourselves until we're blue in the face, but we keep getting back the answers. Thank you very much for writing your congressperson. We'll be happy to deal with this, and we never hear anything. So where does it go? Where do we go from here?
I think the key is to hold, when members hold their public hearings and forums when they go back to the district, to bring this stuff up, to basically shame them in public.
And again, I'm going to kind of talk to you with a little bit of your experience here, being in and around the Beltway and on Capitol Hill. When all this comes up and when the public talks about it, did you ever really hear a lot of representatives, Congress, senators going, hey, I really have to take care of that. That's important. I got to deal with it. I got to believe you didn't hear a whole lot of conversation like that.
Again, you have a few people, and Senator Coburn, again, he's fighting a disease, so that's why he had to retire. But he was like a voice in the wilderness, and even he wasn't covered that often by the news.
How much of this is lobbyists stuffing their pockets?
Part of it is certainly lobbyists stuffing their pockets, because some of this money is being diverted that way. You have contractors who get paid performance bonuses even when they don't perform, and many of them are big PAC donors and individual donors to these members. But I think a lot of it gets back to members don't see it as a sexy issue. They would much rather scream at each other in hyper-partisan ways. They want to have battles between the executive branch and the legislative branch, and they think that that's the sexy area, instead of looking at all the waste, which if we actually addressed all the waste, we would balance the budget. We would start to knock our debt down.
And you wouldn't have to raise taxes, right?
Exactly. Absolutely. I mean, you have the General Accountability Office, and you have 73 inspector generals with some of them with huge staffs.
All right, I tell you what, I'm going to ask you to hold on 1 second, Scott. We're just up against the block. Hold on one second. We'll come back. Oh, yeah, by the way, in case you're wondering, folks, Senator Coburn, $25 billion in waste for over 100 projects. We'll focus next on the priorities of the current Republican congressional leadership when MidPoint continues. From waste to wondering what's next on the agenda and trying to get it right, welcome back to MidPoint, the former Chief Administrative Officer for the U.S. House of Representatives, 104th Congress, Scot Faulkner. Scott, before we move on to the Republicans here and talk a little bit about some prescience, if you will, this just handed to me, according to the White House, the president's fiscal 2016 budget proposes a roughly 7% increase in spending over mandatory levels set in the spending caps, and of course that goes back to sequestration. Here we go, right here. 7% more the president is going to ask for. That's coming out of your pocket, my pocket, and there's billions sitting out there that really could be used to do all this. Yes?
Absolutely.
What do we then, I guess I'm asking a question which I really guess there is no answer for, but the president wants to continue to raise taxes. We see all this sitting here. We see all this waste sitting here. Is this going to take some guts? Is this going to take a spine from more people, more Republicans, if you will, now in Congress, to stand up and hold this up? I mean, I have a piece of paper in my hand that has a report. Hold this up to the president and say, Mr. President, here's $10 billion, here's $25 billion. Why don't you use this to basically take care of the food stamp issue and everybody else? Is it going to take that?
It's going to take that, but you're right. I mean, it's a case of they need some more IQ points up on Capitol Hill, and they need vertebrae on Capitol Hill. They have neither.
Well, let's talk about that with that vertebrae and also having those IQ points. As we move forward here, and the Republicans now have control, what is it about their evolution here? Because I hear the words evolution and revolution many times when we talk about this Congress here. What's most important here? What have they got to do to gain back the credibility of the American voters?
They need to have message discipline, for one. I mean, they are all over the map, and they're even into like a 3 to 6 hour news cycle, the number of issues they bring up at one time. I mean, here's an example. This week, the House of Representatives passed several extremely useful, tangible, substantive bills with bipartisan support dealing with human trafficking, a very positive issue. They moved them forward quickly. They came up under suspension of the rules. Why wasn't that talked about anywhere? They could have started this week with a positive bipartisan message that addressed an important issue and been positive all across the board. Not one member brought it up anywhere. It just went through the Congress, and they instead went after all this inside baseball stuff, which makes them look like business as usual.
How could that be a winning strategy? Because if you've got things sitting out here, I mean, I've got lists of things sitting here that they need to go after right now, and instead we're going after, for instance, the Hire More Heroes Act, which is a great idea, but it really didn't mean a lot of jobs. And there's people also saying that Keystone doesn't mean a lot of jobs down the road. They've got hard stuff sitting here. So what do they need? I mean, where's that point now, Scott, from what you see, that they have got to shut up about everything else at this point and focus down on one or two things?
Again, they should have message of the week, and this week it should have been human trafficking. It would have been a bipartisan message, very positive. We're governing, we're addressing important issues, and we're doing it with votes across the aisle. That would have been very positive this week. The other is you have dozens and dozens and dozens of committees and subcommittees in the House and the Senate, and every one of them has oversight responsibility. They could make the 73 inspector generals and the Government Accountability Office senior players rock stars. They could bring them in. There's 9,000 reports issued every year by that collective group of independent auditors, and they could bring them in, every month, every other month, focus on an agency and basically highlight the waste. Again, those IGs and the GAO in those 9,000 reports documented $630 billion in waste last year alone.
Here's a note to Congress and also to the president. If you really want to go ahead and feed kids, take care of housing, take care of schools, and take care of the infrastructure, get rid of the waste. Then we wouldn't have to worry about it.
That's like 25% of the entire federal budget right there.
And we wouldn't have to worry about taxing the American people or starting to go after certain people to pay more than their quote-unquote fair share. Scot Faulkner, always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks so much. We'll do this again, and we'll continue hammering away.
Unfortunately, there's always going to be more waste, and there's always going to be more stupidity in Congress.
And we'll try and set it right every time. Scot, thanks so much for joining us, and MidPoint will continue.